Hello, and thanks for joining us for the final big game bound of the regular season. Yes, we've reached week 17, and we still don't have a complete picture for the playoffs. So coming up on this week's show, we'll call on Ty Halleck to talk about some of the big games in the final weekend. He'll also reveal his latest top 5. Our big game bound correspondents break down the big games between the 49ers and the Seahawks and the Titans versus the Texans. And we have a very special guest. Former Lions quarterback Eric Hipple joins us for a difficult but very important conversation about the need to talk openly about mental health. Suicide is something that has impacted his life on a very personal level. Time for What the Halleck. Ty Halleck is our big game bound NFL analyst. Played 7 seasons in the NFL with the Bears, the Jaguars, and the Lions. And Ty, the playoff spots in the NFC are all set, but we still don't know who plays who gets home field advantage. Makes for a great final week, doesn't it?
It really does. And when you look at these teams and how they are setting up, it's what's going to happen next in some of the interesting matchups you have. But it's the Seattle Seahawks who really are most intriguing to me. They had an opportunity to beat Arizona this last week, which they didn't, to then get themselves in position to have San Francisco come to them and actually solidify home field advantage. So by losing, they've kind of muddied up their own waters, other than the fact that they can, obviously get a win and kind of reposition themselves. But this whole last weekend really should be a fun one to watch. When you think about the Pittsburgh Steelers coming in to play the Baltimore Ravens, Texans playing against Tennessee, which is implications there. And certainly then what we just talked about, the San Francisco 49ers and the Seattle Seahawks. So there's some games that really mean something. It's just philosophically, like, do you have to get that home field advantage or solidify yourself in there? Or is it something where, in the Baltimore Ravens scenario, do you rest some players potentially? It's remained to be seen.
Yeah, what do you do with Lamar Jackson? Ravens have already clinched, so this game means nothing to them. But they're in the middle of games that mean something to those other teams. They've got to play the Steelers. Steelers need a win. Titans need a win. If they win, they clinch. Do you owe it to the Titans to play Lamar Jackson?
Yeah, I think ultimately they've kind of shown their hand this last week that they're going to play Lamar Jackson. Now, how much they ultimately play him in that game, pending on how it goes. But it looks like they're committed to playing. We talked about, not letting your team kind of get off sync, if you will. Look, the National Football League this late in the season, making sure your guys are very attentive in meetings and play, et cetera. Now, certainly this is a little bit different because they're completely clinched. But the Pittsburgh Steelers have an opportunity to get in. The Dallas Cowboys got an opportunity to get in. You're talking about Tennessee. All these things are predicated on somebody else, and even the Philadelphia Eagles got to take care of their own business to not let something get away from them. So I think the Baltimore Ravens don't owe it certainly to another team. I think they owe it to their own team to make sure they get in, stay on mark, stay with the rhythm that they have, but then in the event that it gets, in their field of play where they're settled, then I think you certainly talk about pulling out somebody like Lamar Jackson.
Texans, do you just go for the jugular and try and knock a division rival out of the playoffs so you don't have to face him again? Therefore, do you play Deshaun Watson this week, or do you maybe let off the gas a little bit and rest him for the playoffs? He's a guy you have to have.
Right. Well, again, every front office has a thought process. To me, you definitely go for the jugular, knock out the division opponent, and you play Deshaun Watson, because at the end of the day, you want to solidify where you're at, and that particular team needs the consistency of good play, and this is a great opportunity with the divisional foe. I think they should put the gas pedal down.
Lamar Jackson, again, any question he's the MVP of the league? Is there anybody else in the conversation right now?
Well, I think there's guys to look at. I think they're all in the fringes. I think what Lamar Jackson has done this year, setting the rushing record, he's been unbelievable passing the ball. He's been very athletic in everything he's done, but he's played quarterback the best of anybody, and the fact that they got home field advantage and look to make a run, I think he's your MVP hands down.
All right, just a minor tweak in your top 5 this week.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the different groups, I brought the New England Patriots back. Part of that's because Seattle lost a very winnable game against the Arizona Cardinals. The Saints I bumped up a little bit, getting into 4, because the Chiefs, I think, have all the pieces there, and their defense seems to be playing better. They got a great quarterback. The 49ers, tough test against LA Rams this week. but answer that. I think they're still one of the youngest, most athletic football teams in the National Football League. And then the Baltimore Ravens, led by Lamar Jackson, we're talking about, who should be a runaway candidate for the MVP, but they also got a very good defense, and I would expect that they're going to put the gas pedal down themselves and win a game against the Pittsburgh Steelers at home.
And what's crazy is you look at that top five, and the Chiefs and the 49ers still, at this point, going into the final week of the regular season, might have to be playing wild card games. In the wild card round.
Yeah, unbelievable to think about that for the winning records those guys have, but that's just kind of the way that it's set up. And like we talked about, maybe it's time to have a conversation in the off-season meetings about doing some ranking here because of how bad some of these other divisions have been.
The biggest game of the final week of the regular season, no question about it. 49ers at Seahawks on Sunday Night Football. Mark Carpenter is our 49ers correspondent, joins us from San Francisco. Mark, 49ers win, they get home field advantage in the NFC. Lose, and they're a wild card. I know a loss doesn't end their season, but is it going too far to say the playoffs begin for them on Sunday?
Talk about some really big stakes, huh, Jack? I think it's fair for this 49ers team that the playoffs start not only this Sunday, but they started weeks ago, all right? I go back to late November when they're playing all those high-profile games against the Packers, the Saints, the Ravens. No easy outs on this schedule. Once they're done with all that, they lose to Atlanta, and then they had to go through the Rams, have another division game. They had the Cardinals sprinkled in there, and then here you go. You got a major matchup at CenturyLink against Seattle with so much attached to this. You're talking about all these emotional games, and throughout this run, it's been impressive to watch the 49ers and see them winning. But the thing is, they've had to keep winning because the Saints are still right there. The Seahawks are still there. The Packers are hanging around. And so, the 49ers have been playing these high-stakes games here, and this instance against Seattle is no different. So they've become accustomed to these postseason-type atmospheres.
Mark, any chance all these high-stakes games have worn this team out?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at it, just the injury report, right? The fact that there's no D Ford. They lost Quan Alexander. They lost their starting center, Weston Richburg. Richard Sherman, yeah, he missed the week against Atlanta, and then you don't really know how healthy he is. All those injuries out in the secondary really piling up with this team, and that has been a serious question throughout this run. I mean, you're talking about a team that had a bye week in week 3 or 4, and you're talking about 13 straight games now to end the year. It's brutal enough playing, an NFL game, and it's also, compounded even more when you're playing these types of emotional games. And I think you can also see how tired the 49ers were down the stretch. I mean, not only the Rams game, but definitely in that Atlanta game, the fact that the Falcons were still hanging around and they steal it on the final seconds, and just the 49ers offense looked out of sorts, and then the defense, you look at how the games have been going on for the last several weeks. Teams have been moving the ball against the 49ers attack, and that seems to be a sign of fatigue and also missing a bunch of guys due to injuries.
The Seahawks handed the 49ers their first loss this season. That was at home. Now they have to head to Seattle. Seahawks, they may be 11-4, but their point differential is just 12. Are they as good as their record says they are?
That's been the question throughout the entire season, right? And they just keep winning. And, we bring up the stats about them in one-score games, all right? 9-1 entering December. And I think the X factor is you look at the roster here, all right? You don't really have a lot of big-name guys. Sure, you got Jadeveon Clowney and you got Dwayne Brown on the offensive line, but you look at the big-name players. I mean, there certainly is not the Legion of Boom Seahawks, all right? You don't have the big names at running back and wide receiver. The X factor all comes down to Russell Wilson. Not only one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the league, he's one of the most explosive. He doesn't make mistakes. He is crucial down the stretch. He's always making big plays, and he always finds a way to keep his team in it. Yes, they had a bad game against the Arizona Cardinals, right? They lost a stinker at home, to really a poor Cardinals team. But throughout the year, the book on the Seahawks has been is they maximize what they can get out of the guys they have. Russell Wilson, he's an MVP caliber type player, and you combine that with the winning culture that Pete Carroll has established, it's like, hey, they're right there. It wouldn't surprise me if they ended up snagging the top seed and the road to the Super Bowl goes through them. And, we can keep talking about, how good are they really? And at the same time, they just keep winning games. And also, too, you talk with 49ers fans, Jack, the Seahawks are the one team Niners fans don't want to be playing at this time of year, just because of the stakes involved. Weird things always happen in Seattle, and historically, when the Seahawks have been on this run, since they've been in the division, the Niners have had a very difficult time winning at their place.
Yeah, last thing for you, Mark. Wilson will be even more crucial now that Chris Carson's out with that hip injury. How aggressive do the 49ers get defensively, putting pressure on that Seahawks passing game?
You know, it really is curious, and it is amazing how the story has developed, all right? Coming out of the Cardinals game, they not only lose that one, but, I mean, some heavy losses. They lose Carson. They're down to one healthy running back when that game is over with, a guy that played only 8 NFL snaps. You got Dwayne Brown, the left tackle, right, the guy that they traded for. He's going through surgery. They expect to get him back in the playoffs. We'll have to see how that plays out. But the Seahawks are to a point where they're desperate. They're turning to Marshawn Lynch. They're turning to Robert Turbin. And, you know, I think that can help, and I really think it does provide an X factor in terms of game planning because they're veterans. They already know the system, and, you know, who knows what kind of shape they'll be in, but at least there are options. And the 49ers can get aggressive in trying to go after Russell Wilson, but as he showed in that first matchup back at Santa Clara, he thrives on those types of aggressive pass rushes because he can just rip off a 30 to 40-yard run, and that's what makes him so scary. That's what makes him so difficult to plan for. You put some veterans around him with guys that already know the system, guys like Turbin and Lynch, and here you go again. The Seahawks have tried to retool this thing, and like they have done all year, people questioning how good this team really is, they seem to always find a way, and Week 17, this type of significant matchup is no different.
Titans-Texans is another big matchup on Sunday. That's a 4:25 kickoff on CBS. Our Titans correspondent is Corey Curtis. He joins us from Nashville. Corey, you warned us about Derrick Henry's hamstring last week. Will he be able to go this Sunday?
Well, you know, it kind of caught us a little off guard this weekend. You know, ultimately what the Titans decided to do was sit him and get him as healthy as possible for what is a win and get in game against the Texans this weekend. He will be ready to go. Will he be 100%? No, he won't, but he'll be as healthy as he's been in the last 4 to 6 weeks for the Titans, and that's important.
All right, last week's loss knocked them out of contention for the division championship, but they're still in the catbird seat for that final playoff spot in the AFC. Win, they're in. Do you expect Houston to treat this game like it really matters to them, or will Deshaun Watson and some other key players rest up for the playoffs?
Well, that's really the big question we're all facing. You know, actually, when the Texans won on Saturday last week, that locked up the division for them, and that made the decision to sit Henry easier. Now, they could have had some advantage by beating the Saints last week. A simple Steelers loss this weekend would have put them into the playoffs, but they put themselves into that position, as you said, of winning and being in. Now, I know earlier this week, Coach O'Brien down in Houston was asked, will he play his starters? And his only answer was, will play to win. That's not exactly convincing. They do have a shot at the 3 seed, but that's if you believe the Chargers can beat the Chiefs, which I don't know if any of us believe is actually going to happen. So I guess for me, I would be a little surprised to see the Texans full go with their starters. They, I'm sure, want to be healthy in the playoffs. There's a lot of different semantics we can play with who would you rather play. But number one, you'd rather have Deshaun Watson, Laramie Tunsil, DeAndre Hopkins, and all those guys healthy for this football game that they're going to play in January, not the last one in December.
Absolutely. Now, win this game. They finished 9-7 for a 4th straight year. What is keeping the Titans from getting over the hump and being a serious player in the AFC?
Well, you know, Jack, this summer, the entire theme for this team was good to great. They'd been 9-7, 3 straight years. They wanted to get over that hump, but of course started the season slowly at 2-4 because of a variety of injuries and a suspension to Taylor Lewan. And then, you know, this season, you know, is a lot like they had a couple of seasons ago, you know, when they were 8-4 and then they dropped 3 straight to get to 8-7. Well, here the Titans were. They were sitting at 8-5. I mean, 8-5. You know, with 2 home games, 2 big home games, and they lost them both. Yeah, the Texans are good, and yeah, the Saints are really good. But when you're really good, you win on your home field. And the Tennessee Titans went 4-4 at home this season, and that simply is not good enough. Now, is it the play of the quarterback? Is it the play of the defense? Is it the play of the offensive line? Is it the head coach? Is it the kicking game? I don't think there's a simple answer to all that, other than the fact that this team still has to be better, still has to have more game changers on it. I think they've got more game changers than they used to have, but when you think of elite players in the National Football League, the Tennessee Titans don't come immediately to mind. They've got some very good players, but they're still missing some of those elite players, and I think that's what it takes quite often in this league to get to the very top.
Corey, how crucial is this game to Ryan Tannehill's future in Tennessee? If he lays an egg, will they look to draft a quarterback, or is he the guy they invest in no matter what this year?
Yeah, Jack, we were thinking about that exact same question this week when we put our TN Nation poll out there. We said, does this game matter for the future of Ryan Tannehill and what the Titans are going to do with him? Or have you seen enough at this point? And I'm frankly a little surprised at some of the early results we got. Over 60% of our fans out there said that this game matters to whether they should bring him back long-term next year or not. Now, look, I think they want to move forward with him, but I think it could affect whether they franchise him for 1 year and just take a one-year flyer on him for next season, or they give him, say, like a 3-year, $78, $80 million deal to be their guy. You know, it's a very big question that they're facing because they've got a number of players in the primes of their career, and you got to have that quarterback position right. He would have to be really awful to not be brought back next year because the other 9 games have all been pretty good. But this is the big one. I said, you know, on our show, I said this is his defining moment. You have to be able to stand up in your defining moment and deliver big. How many times have we heard about Kirk Cousins being 0-8 on Monday Night Football? Because when the spotlight's on, that's when you got to perform. So I do think it's a big game for Ryan Tannehill. I don't think so big that he won't be back next year, but it could affect the terms of the deal.
We are dedicating a big portion of this show to our big guest this week. Mental health is such an important conversation, and one of the men who's become a very important voice is former Detroit Lions quarterback Eric Hipple. Eric joins us now, and Eric will weave your story in throughout this conversation for viewers that haven't heard. First, how important is it that we remove the stigma that comes with suicide and mental health?
Well, I think it's even more important than removing the stigma of the actual illness, because I really believe that stigma has been really knocked down a lot, but it's the stigma of getting help that's there, okay? So I think we're doing a lot of talking, but there are still barriers and stuff to getting help, and I think that's where the stigma comes into. You know, the access to care and the barriers that are there is really what gets in the way, as people start talking about it like that's a really big deal to go get help, as opposed to, you know, it's the natural thing to do if you're suffering from something.
Eric, you travel the country and talk about mental health and suicide, not an easy subject to talk about. How are you able to do it?
Well, you know, it's over time. You know, I've recognized that mental health is a continuum. That means it's always evolving and continues on. And so what we do from a day-to-day basis, I mean, if something does happen to us, then it's what we do in response to that and not get caught up in the, like you said, the stigma of guilt, of shame, of and retreat and withdrawal. Then I think we're able to, you know, have some resilience in overcoming some things that happen to us. But I think it's really the educational piece of that this is not just a one or the other. It's not a diagnosis or a non-diagnosis. It's actually an ongoing, you know, journey that we're on.
Eric, your message comes from an experience that few have lived through. You tried to take your life when you jumped out of a car traveling at more than 70 miles an hour. How did you get to a place where you thought that was the best option?
You know, that's the sneaky thing about mental health or mental illness, is that it's not just a one thing that happens that then you respond to. It's a buildup over time. And when I left the sport, I left in, you know, as I think as almost every player does, or these big transitions, whether it's from military or it's from, you know, being an executive and, you know, the identity that you have. And for me, there was a lot of identity associated. Since 9 years old, you know, I've been wearing a uniform, and at 32 years old, all of a sudden I can't wear that uniform anymore. And even though I started, you know, a business and jumped into it, it was kind of new and thriving at first, but it became, is this it? Is this all there is? And it was that emotional, like all of a sudden realizing that, wow. And I started struggling. trying to find myself and identity loss. And it got to the point where things started falling apart around me, started self-medicating, started withdrawing. And it looked like a very impulsive act, jumping out of a car that my wife was driving, and I wrote a quick note to her and just said sorry, and that I loved her, but I jumped. And but it's actually things that I've been thinking about in my head for quite a while. That was just the worthlessness, the loss of identity, and just not being connected. And I think that not connected is the biggest piece.
How do players, what's your message to players now? Because I know you do some work with the NFL. How do you help them through that identity thing? If they put all their identity in football and then it's gone, what do they have? How do you help them through that?
I think that the biggest piece is letting them, realizing the fact that that is not who you are. Now, you did it, and you did it really, really well, so honor it, okay? Don't try and say that's all I am and who I was. That's not who you are. You are the person that got yourself there, but trying to separate those two things from the jersey hanging on the wall than the heart inside. And if we can come to that and that reinvention piece and go through the transition to where else and you re-identify, you catch up to who you are and really focus on that piece of it, then you're not hiding from the fact. I know so many players that when they finished the game, they wouldn't watch football. They didn't hang their stuff up on the wall. They didn't put their trophies out because it was so painful, them all of a sudden having that identity yanked away from them. Their support system's gone. Their doctors are gone. Their job and money is gone. And I don't mean gone, but I mean it quits flowing in. And it's all of a sudden that moment is, wow, it's painful. And so I don't want to be reminded of it. And so I won't put the trophies out. I won't watch it on TV. Instead of the opposite, which is, hey, man, it was so hard to get there. So honor that point. Honor that moment that you got there, right? But then say, I did it really, really well. Now I'm on to the next phase of my life. But do it in a healthy way and an energetic way, and that re-identifying on who exactly that you are.
Eric, I know your suicide attempt wasn't even rock bottom for you. You had to deal with the absolute worst of tragedies when your son Jeff took his life. What's the most important message you deliver to parents and students, administrators, when you travel the country and give your speeches?
The biggest message that I give is that you're not alone. Understanding the fact that what are these things that do happen to us? Transition is one of them. I mean, when somebody goes from middle school to high school, that's a huge transition. When somebody goes from high school to college, it's a huge transition. There's transitions that happen to them in home, where there are family things that might happen, divorce might happen, and then there's traumas that are involved. I mean, the fact that maybe a divorce did happen, maybe there's abuse, maybe it's just being rejected. And so maybe somebody who's rejected at school feels that. And so it's that isolation and disconnect that gives us, the mindset of, I'm alone, I'm the only one going through this, nobody understands. And it's just reconnecting and being able to realize what's happening to you, that these are symptoms of something that's going on, and that we need to do something about it. So there's a sense of empowerment in that too, that it's up to us actually to reach out, okay? But we can't reach out if we're involved in a society that doesn't accept us, with a hand coming back to pull us up. And so it's a two-way street, but it does include the person themselves of understanding that, I need to reach out as well. And so asking for help is a big deal.
When you look back now and reflect on where you were, what were some of the red flags that you see now that you didn't see then, as a parent and in your own personal case?
Well, it was difficult because I'd gone through this myself, and so I didn't think that anybody else would ever go through what I'm going through. I thought it was just me, right? And that includes the jumping out of the car piece. I picked myself back up, and for the next 3 years, okay, well, I'll just muster through this and push through. But when my son started, going through these things, I didn't really connect with him, say, well, this couldn't possibly be happening to him. And yet he had every symptom that I had. Sleep. He was having some sleep issues, concentration. His grades started falling in school. He became ineligible to play basketball. He was captain because of, the not doing the schoolwork, and then not wanting to go to school, a change of friends, to just all that stuff, and I didn't recognize any of it. And unfortunately, when he took his life, they all of a sudden just all popped up and all the dots connected, and that was really hard for me to take, because I realized I could have probably done something. And so the guilt and, the loss is bad enough as it is, but when you mix it in with shame and guilt and everything else, how did I miss this? It was really, really difficult. But I would say it's just recognizing some of the symptoms, but not only that, being able to listen, and be supportive. You can't change their feelings, but you can be supportive of them. You can't change their, you can change some of their behaviors because of boundaries, but you can't change all their behaviors, but you can listen and help them find the right key or the right open door, so you can help them to the door. And that's the main thing, is being supportive and listening.
I'm sure some people, friends and family, were probably very worried about you after that happened. How did you get through that yourself and get to the place where you are today?
About the opposite of how you're supposed to. So I came on, the wheels fell off me. I might not have all four of them on anyway, but all four of them came off. And just, self-medicating, guilt was huge. I just wanted to, there's one thing I knew is I couldn't, suicide, because now I know what it feels like, and it hurts really bad. So I didn't want to do that to anybody. And so just being numb became like the answer for that. And I did that, for about a year straight, where it's just, anger, not anger at anybody. It was anger at myself. It wasn't at him. It wasn't at God. It was at me. And getting over that was really, really difficult to do. I finally actually got arrested for a DUI, had some legal issues I had to deal with. But coming out of that was I decided to try and get some education on what this damn thing is, right? And I did, and it was at the University of Michigan Depression Center that I ended up turning to, and they were first of its kind, a depression center. They actually called it depression, so they're knocking down the stigma. And when I started learning what this thing is, the brain illness and the symptoms to it, that it can be treated, and it was just a whole other world opened up. And I vowed that, I need to get involved, but also need to help other people understand and try to educate. And so that's when they hired me, and we started working on different programs to build and to get people to reach out to help and knock down the stigma in some of these hard to reach populations.
That's great. I know you've written the book, Real Men Do Cry, and you helped put together the first comprehensive mental health survey for NFL, the Players Association. What was on that survey, Eric, and have you seen some results?
What came out of that thing was we actually showed we had 50% response on our survey, which is huge. Usually you might get maybe 10%, and that's high. We got 50% because players were asking questions. And what came back was about 15% of guys were moderately to severely depressed, former players at that point in time. And what really stood out to me was we had a couple open questions, and it had to ask about transition. Every single player had problems with the transition, and significant problems at the moment they went through it. Now, some rebounded pretty quick, some struggled, and some didn't fare very well at all. And but to me, the main thing was that transition is huge. And so then I started looking at what loss looks like, tying it to a traumatic type of event when all of a sudden you're ostracized out of, and things are taken away, your support systems, your doctors, all that stuff is gone. Your relationships change, and that became very big to me because that really stood out, and that's eventually what we ended up kind of laying on. We started doing psychiatric evaluations for the NFLPA for guys who were struggling, but ultimately started looking at that transition in a big way.
That'll do it for week 17 of Big Game Bound. A big thanks to Ty Halleck, our correspondents, Corey Curtis and Mark Carpenter, and Eric Hipple. For our producer, Spencer Wheelock, and our crew in Grand Rapids, I'm Jack Doles. Thanks for joining us. Happy holidays. We'll see you again next time on Big Game Bound.